Hi Camp Ivika, it's me Sydney, and I'm here to read you the next part of the book. This chapter is called The Marvelous Ears. Back in the cave, the big friendly giant sat Sophie down once again on the enormous table. "Is you quite snugly in there in your nightie?" he asked. "You isn't frigidly cold." "I'm fine," Sophie said. "I cannot help thinking," said the BFG, "'bout your poor mother and father. By now they must be jippin' and scumpin' all over the house shoutin', 'Hello, hello, where is Sophie gone?'" "I don't have a mother and father," said Sophie. "They both died when I was a baby." "Oh, you poor little scrumpet," cried the BFG. "Is you not missing them very badly?" "Not really," Sophie said, "because I never knew them." "You is making me sad," the BFG said, rubbing his eyes. "Don't be sad," Sophie said. "No one is going to be worrying too much about me. This place you took me from was the village orphanage. We are all orphans in there." "You is an orphan?" "Yes." "How many is there in there?" "10 of us," Sophie said, "all little girls." "Was you happy there?" the BFG asked. "I hated it," Sophie said. "The woman who ran it was called Miss Clunkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, like getting out of bed at night or not folding up your clothes, you got punished." "How was you getting punished?" "She locked us in the dark cellar for a day and a night without anything to eat or drink." "The rotten old Ross wrapper!" cried the BFG. "It was horrid," Sophie said. "We used to dread it. There were rats down there. We could hear them creeping about." The filthy old fizz wiggler," shouted the BFG. "That is the horridest thing I am hearing for years. You is making me sadder than ever." All at once, a huge tear that would have filled the bucket rolled down from one of the BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. It made quite a puddle. Sophie watched with astonishment. "What a strange and moody creature this is," she thought. "One moment he is telling me my head is full of squashed flies, and the next moment his heart is melting for me because Miss Clunkers locks us in the cellar." "The thing that worries me," Sophie said, "is having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, would I?" "All is my fault," the BFG said. "I is the one who kidnapped you." Yet another enormous tear welled from his eye and splashed on the floor. Now I come to think of it, I won't actually be here all that long," said Sophie. "I is afraid you will," the BFG said. "No, I won't," Sophie said. "Those brutes out there are bound to catch me sooner or later and have me for tea." "I is never letting that happen," the BFG said. For a few moments the cave was silent. Then Sophie said, "May I ask you a question?" The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand and gave Sophie a long, thoughtful stare. "Shoot away," he said. "Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? Why were you poking that long trumpet thing into Gucci children's bedroom and then blowing through it?" "Aha!" cried the BFG, sitting up suddenly in his chair. "Now we is getting noisier than a Parker." "And the suitcase you were carrying," Sophie said. "What on earth was that all about?" The BFG stared suspiciously at the girl, sitting cross-legged on the table. "You is asking me to tell you who's whoopsie big secrets," he said. "Secrets that nobody is ever hearing before." "I won't tell a soul," Sophie said. "I swear it. How could I anyways? I am stuck here for the rest of my life." "You could be telling the other giants." "No, I couldn't," Sophie said. "You told me they would eat me up in the moment they saw me." "And so they would," said the BFG. "You is a human being, and human beings is like straw bunkles and cream to those giants. If they are going to eat me the moment they see me, then I wouldn't have to tell them anything, would I?" Sophie said. "You wouldn't," said the BFG. "Then why'd you say I might?" "Because I is a brimful of buzzburgers," the BFG said. "If you listen to everything I am saying, you will be getting an earache." "Please tell me what you were doing in our village," Sophie said. "I promise you can trust me." "Would you teach me how to make an elephant?" the BFG said. "What do you mean?" Sophie said. "I would dearly love to have an elephant to ride on," the BFG said dreamingly. "I would so much love to have a jumbly big elephant and go riding through green forests picking peachy fruits off the trees all day long. This is a sizzling hot muck thumping country we livin' in. Nothing grows in it except Snozzcumbers. I would love to go somewhere and pick peachy fruits in the early morning from the back of an elephant." Sophie was quiet. She was moved by this curious statement. "Perhaps one day we will get you an elephant," she said, "and peachy fruits as well. Now tell me, what were you doing in our village?" "If you is really wanting to know what I am doing in your village," the BF said, "I is blowing a dream into the bedroom of those children." "Blowing a dream?" Sophie said. "What do you mean?" "I is blowing a dream, giant," the BFG said. "When all the other giants is galloping off every what way in which to swallow human beings, I is scuttling away to other places to blow dreams into the bedrooms of sleeping children. Nice dreams, lovely golden dreams, dreams that has given the dreamers a happy time." "Now hang on a minute," Sophie said. "Where do you get these dreams?" "I collect them," the BFG said, waving an arm towards all of the rows and rows of bottles on the shelves. "I has billions of them." "You can't collect a dream," Sophie said. "A dream isn't something you can catch a hold of." "You is never gonna understand about it," the BFG said. "That is why I'm not wishing to tell you." "Oh, please tell me," Sophie said. "I will understand. Go on, tell me how you collect dreams. Tell me everything." The BFG settled himself comfortably in his chair and crossed his legs. "Dreams," he said, "is a very mysterious thing. They is floating around in the air like little wispy, misty bubbles, and all the time they is searching for sleeping people." "Can you see 'em?" Sophie asked. "Never at first." "Then how do you catch them if you can't see them?" Sophie asked. "Aha," said the BFG. "Now we is getting on to the dark and dusky secrets. I won't tell a soul." "I is trusting you," the BFG said. He closed his eyes and sat quite still for a moment, while Sophie waited. "A dream," he said, "as it goes whiffling through the night air, is making a tiny little buzzing, humming noise. But this little buzzy hum is so silvery soft it's impossible for a human being to hear." "Can you hear it?" asked Sophie. The BFG pointed up at the enormous truck wheel ears, which he is now beginning to move in and out. He performed his exercise proudly with a little proud smile on his face. "Is you seeing these?" he asked. "How could I miss 'em?" Sophie said. "They maybe is looking a little prosperous to you," the BFG said, "but you must believe me when I say is very extra usual ears indeed. They is not to be coughed at." And here's a picture of the BFG's ears and how big they are. "I'm quite sure they're not," Sophie said. "They is allowing me to hear absolutely every single twiddly little thing." "You mean you can hear things I can't hear?" Sophie said. You is deaf as dumpling compared with me," cried the BFG. "You is hearing only thumping loud noises with those little earwigs of yours, but I'm hearing all the secret whisperings of the world." "Such as what?" Sophie asked. "In your country," he said, "I is hearing the footsteps of a lady bird as she goes walking across the leaf." "Honestly?" Sophie said, begging to be impressed. "What's more, I is hearing those footsteps very loud," the BFG said. "When a ladybird is walking across the leaf, I is hearing her feet go clumpity clumpity clump like giant's footsteps." "Good gracious me," Sophie said. "What else can you hear?" "I is hearing the little ants chittering to each other as they scuttle around in the soil." "You mean you can hear ants talking?" "Every single word," the BFG said. "Although I is not all exactly understanding their language." "Go on," Sophie said. "Sometimes on a very clear night," the BFG said, "and if I am swinging my ears in the right direction," and here he swiveled his great ears upwards so they were facing the ceiling, "if I is swinging them like this, and the night is very clear, I is sometime hearing faraway music coming from the stars in the sky." A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. She sat very quiet, waiting for more. "My ears is what told me you were watching me out of your window last night," the BFG said. "But I didn't make a sound," Sophie said. "I was hearing your heart beating across the road," the BFG said, "loud as a drum." "Go on," Sophie said, "please." "I can hear plants and trees." "Do they talk?" Sophie said. "They is not exactly talking," said the BFG. But they is making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, if I is twisting the stem of the flower till it breaks, then the plant is screaming. I can hear it screaming, and screaming very clearly. You don't mean it, Sophie cried. How awful! It is screaming just like you would be screaming if someone was twisting your right arm off. Is that really true? Sophie asked. You think I is swiffle-gigging you? It is rather hard to believe. Then I stopped right here, said the BFG sharply. I is not wishing to be called a fibster. Oh no, I'm not calling you anything, Sophie cried. I believe you. I do. I really do. Please go on. The BFG gave her a long, hard stare. Sophie looked right back at him. Her face opened to his. I believe you, she said softly. She had offended him. She could see that. I wouldn't ever be fibbing to you, he said. I know you wouldn't, Sophie said. But you must understand that it isn't easy to believe such amazing things straight away. I understand that, the BFG said. So do please forgive me and go on, she said. He waited a while longer, and then he said, It is the same with trees as it is with flowers. If I is chopping an axe into the trunk of a tree, I is hearing a terrible sound coming from inside the heart of the tree. What sort of sound? Sophie asked. A soft moaning sound, the BFG said. It is like the sound of an old man is making when he's dying slowly. He paused. The cave was very silent. Trees is living and growing just like you and me, he said. They is alive, so is plants. He was sitting very straight in his chair now, his hands clasped together tightly in front of him. His face was bright, his eyes round and bright as 2 stars. Such wonderful and terrible sounds I is hearing, he said. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself, but some is like glorious music. He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitement of his emotions. His face was beautiful in its blaze of emotions. Tell me some more about them, Sophie said quietly. You just ought to be hearing the little mices talking, he said. Little mices is always talking to each other, and I is hearing them as loud as my own voice. What do they say? Sophie asked. Only the mices know that, he said. Spiders is also talking a great deal. You might not be thinking about it, but spiders is the most tremendous natterboxes, and when they is spinning their webs, they is singing all the time. They is singing sweeter than a nightingale. Who else do you hear? Sophie asked. One of the biggest chat bags is the caterpillars, the BFG said. What do they say? They is arguing all the time about who is going to be the prettiest butterfly. That is all they ever talking about. Is there a dream floating around in here now? Sophie asked. The BFG moved his great ears this way and that, listening intently. He shook his head. There is no dream in here, he said, except in the bottles. I has a special place to go for catching dreams. They is not often come into giant country. How do you catch them? The same way you catch butterflies, the BFG answered. With a net. He stood up and crossed to the corner of the cave where a pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net on the end of it. Here's the dream catcher, he said, grasping the pole in one hand. Every morning, I is going out and snitching new dreams to put in my bottles. Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation. I is getting hungry, he said. It's time for eats. All right. The next chapter is called Snozzcumbers. But if you don't eat people like all the others, Sophie said, then what do you live on? That is a squinchling, tricky problem around here, the BFG answered. In this slosh-flunking giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pigwinkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky-poo vegetable. It's called the Snozzcucumber. The Snozzcucumber, cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square white teeth. Yesterday, he said, we was not believing in giants, was we? Today we is not believing in Snozzcumbers. Just because we happen not to have actually seen something with our own 2 little winkles, we think it's not existing. What about, for instance, the great squeezely snot chopper? I beg your pardon, Sophie asked. And the humple crimp? What's that? Sophie said. And the wapple prascal? The what? Sophie said. And the crumple scoodle? Are they animals? Sophie asked. They is common animals, the BFG contemptuously said. I is not very known all giant myself, but it seems to me that you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool." "You mean cotton wool?" Sophie said. "What I mean and what I say is two different things," the BFG announced rather grandly. "I will now show you a Snozzcucumber." The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long again as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as its perambulator. It was black with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles. And here's the Snozzcumber. Okay. "Here is the repulsant Snozzcumber," cried the BFG, waving it about. "I snoggle it, I misplace it, I dispunge it, but because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky poo Snozzcumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and bones." "You mean skin and bones?" Sophie said. "I know it is bones," said the BFG, "but please understand that I cannot be helping it if sometimes is saying things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time." The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to be rude." "There never was any schools to teach me talking in giant country," the BFG said sadly. "But couldn't your mother have taught you?" Sophie asked. "My mother?" cried the BFG. "Giants don't have mothers. Surely you is knowing that." "I did not know that," Sophie said. "Whoever heard of a woman giant?" shouted the BFG, waving a Snozzcumber around his head like a lasso. "There never was a woman giant, and there never will be one. Giants is always men." Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. "In that case," she said, "how were you born?" "Giants isn't born," the BFG said. "Giants appears, and that's all there is to it. They simply appears, the same way as the sun and the stars." "And when did you appear?" Sophie asked. "Now how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that?" said the BFG. "It was so long ago I couldn't count." "You mean you don't even know how old you are?" "No giant is knowing that," the BFG said. "All I is knowing about myself is that I is very old, very, very old and crumply, perhaps as old as the earth." "What happens when a giant dies?" Sophie asked. "Giants is never dying," the BFG answered. "Sometimes and quite suddenly a giant is disappearing and nobody is ever really knowing where he goes. But mostly us giants is simply going on and on like whiffly all-time twiddlers." The BFG was still holding the awesome Snozzcumber in his right hand, and now he put one end into his mouth and bit off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice. "It's fiddling," he sputtered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of Snozzcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. "It's disgusterous," the BFG gurgled. "It's sickable, it's rotsome, it's maggot-wise. Try it yourself, this fulsome Snozzcumber." "No, thank you," Sophie said, backing away. "It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it," said the BFG. "Go on, you snipsy little winkle. Have a go." Sophie took a small nibble. "Ugh!" she sputtered. "Oh no! Oh gosh! Oh help!" She spat it out quickly. "It tastes like frog skins," she gasped, "and rotten fish. Worse than that," cried the BFG, roaring with some laughter. "To me it is the tasting of cockroaches and slimy wanglers." And here's a picture of him spitting it out all over the place. "Do we really have to eat it?" Sophie said. "You do, unless you is wanting to become so thin you will disappear and into a thick ear." Into thin air?" Sophie asked. "A thick ear is something quite different." Once again that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. "Words," he said, "is oh such a twinkly-twinchin' problem to me all my life. So you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I am telling you before, I know exactly the words I am wanting to say, but somehow or another, they isn't always getting spittled around. That happens to everyone, Sophie said. Not like it happens to me, the BFG said. I speak in the most terrible English. I think you speak beautifully, Sophie said. You do? Cried the BFG, suddenly brightening. You really do? Simply beautifully, Sophie repeated. Well, that is the nicest present anybody has ever given me in my whole life, cried the BFG. Are you sure you was not twiddling my leg? And here's a picture of him and Sophie. Of course not, Sophie said. I just love the way you talk. How wondercrump, cried the BFG, still beaming. How whoopsie splunkers. How absolutely squiffling. I is all of a stutter. Listen, Sophie said. We don't have to eat Snozzcumbers. In the field around our village, there are all sorts of lovely vegetables like cauliflower and carrots. Why don't you get some of those next time you go visiting? The BFG raised his great head proudly in the air. I is very honorable giant, he said. I would rather be chewing up rotsome Snozzcumbers than snitching things from your people. You stole me, Sophie said. I did not steal you very much, said the BFG, smiling gently. After all, you is only a tiny little girl. And the next chapter is called The Blood Bottler. All right. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, Runt! Is you in there, Runt? I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt? Look out, cried the BFG. It's the blood bottler. But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous partly eaten Snozzcumber was laying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. Who is you jabbling to in here just now, he boomed. I's jabbling to myself, the BFG answered. Pizzle fizz, shouted the blood bottler. Buggleswap, he boomed. You is talking to a human being. That's what I is thinking. No, no, cried the BFG. Why, yes, boomed the blood bottler. I is guessing you has stitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is thinking it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper. The poor BFG was very nervous. There's no one in here, he stammered. Well, why don't you just leave me alone? The blood bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. Runty little scum screwer, he shouted. Piffling little swish figgler, scrimply little bottle rot, prunty little pog swizzler. I is now going to search the primroses. He grabbed the BFG by the arm. And you is going to help me do it. Us together is going to wrinkle out this tasteful little human being, he shouted. And here's a picture of him, the blood bottler, picking up the BFG. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back, but now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous Snozzcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish-pink. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy-looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips on it that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying on top of one another. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and the rivers of spit ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that the ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The blood bottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows of bottles. You and your pibblin' bottles, he shouted. What is you putting in them? Nothing that would interest you, the BFG answered. You's only interested in guzzling human beings, and you is as dawdly as a dog waggler, cried the blood bottler. Soon the blood bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The Snozzcumber, although it was thick as a primblitter, was not going to hide her if the blood bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of the seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the Snozzcumber, large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was wet and slimy hiding place, but what did that matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The blood bottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the blood bottler grabbed the half-eaten Snozzcumber. The BFG stared at the table. Sophie, where is you? He thought desperately. You cannot possibly be jumbling off that high table, so where is you hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthy, rotsome gulbage you has eaten, boomed the blood bottler, holding up the partly eaten Snozzcumber. You must be cockles to be guzzling such rob squash. For a moment, the blood bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off track. That is the scrumdiddlyest, umptious Snozzcumber, he said. I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a Snozzcumber, blood bottler? Human beings is juicier, the blood bottler said. You is talking rheumity. The BFG said, growling braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on, but please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitcher for my supper. The blood bottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the Snozzcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-fiddling me, is you? Said the blood bottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite. I am positive you will be shouting out, oh, how scrumdiddly umptious this wonder veg is. The BFG would see the greedy blood bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It is not wholesome always to be eating meaty things. Just this once, the blood bottler said. I is going to taste the rotsome eats of yours, but I is warning you that if it is filsome, I am smashing it all over your sludgy little head. He picked up the Snozzcumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, don't, but that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up, up and up. Suddenly there was a crunch as the blood bottler bit a huge hunk off the head. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together, a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch one more time. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. Yow! roared the blood bottler. Ugh, belch, each! And then he spat. All of the great lumps of Snozzcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she most certainly would have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black coat hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she was crouched. You little swine burglar, roared the blood bottler. You little pig swiller. He rushed out at the BFG and smashed what was left of the Snozzcumber all over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable splashed all over the cave. You is not loving it? The BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. Loving it? Yelled the blood bottler. That is the most disastrous thing is ever touching my teeth. You must be buggles to be swallowing stuff like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beans. Eating human beings is wrong and evil, the BFG said. It is guzzling and glumptious, shouted the blood bottler. And tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swallow a few human chili beans. If you is wishing to know why I is choosing Chile, I is not wishing to know anything, the BFG said, very dignified. I is choosing Chile, the blood bottler said, because I is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important I had plenty of cold eats in the scuttling hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Eskimo is a chili bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly. Horrible, the BFG said. You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school children. The blood bottler said, I is very fond indeed of English school children, but they have nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind to go to England with them. You is disgusting, the BFG said, and you is an insult to the giant peoples, shouted the blood bottler. You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squiggly little squirter. You is a pibbling little pipsqueak. You is a cream puff nut. With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. Sophie, he whispered. Sophie, where is you? Sophie! Sophie emerged from under the hem of a black cloak. I'm here, she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. Oh, I am so happy to be finding you all in one lump, he said. I was in his mouth, Sophie said. You was what? Cried the BFG. Sophie told him that had happened. And there I was telling him to eat the filthsome Snozzcumber, and you was all the time inside it, the BFG cried. Not much fun, Sophie said. Just look at you, you poor little childer, cried the BFG. You was all covered in Snozzcumber and giant spit. He set about cleaning her up as best he could. I is hating those other giants more than ever now, he said. You know what I should like? What? Sophie said. I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one. I'd be glad to help you, Sophie said. Let me see if I can think of a way of doing it. And here's him cleaning off Sophie. And that's all for now. Thanks for letting me read to you guys. It was fun. Yeah. Bye.